Hey everybody, it's Chris and Rick Talk Guitars, remote style. That's Chris over there.
Howdy.
Hey, hi. Hi. And I'm Rick. And it's been a while, man. We've been kind of dealing with technical issues and the whole lockdown stuff, but we really wanted to get back on the track and talk about guitar stuff. So Chris and I got together and decided to try to patch this thing together. So what have you been up to, man, since we've talked?
Not as much guitar-wise as I had hoped, but I'm finally, in the last couple of weeks, I kind of circled back and I'm starting to spend some more time with the guitar, which is great. So, yeah, I'm doing some recording, like just little pieces of stuff that I'm dicking around with, like via GarageBand drums and just like kind of soundtracky stuff. And that's been really fun, and that's been occupying a lot of my time. So that's where I'm at. How about you?
That's awesome. I've been buying a lot of stuff online, like, phasers and nut files and all kinds of crazy shit because it's funny. But yeah, so I bought a small stone that you turned me on to and a Phase 90. Did the old A/B test, and of course the small stone won. But they're both cool. I dig them, and also just geeking out on like you, kind of just plugging in and playing. Trying to kind of explore different songs and learn other songs that I haven't learned in a long time. And yeah, just kind of trying to stay with it and keep the guitar vibe going, But yeah, I miss our chats and just, shooting the shit about guitar stuff. And so to that point, we, Chris and I always like to talk about tone, guitar tone. I think it's just a topic that among guitar players anyway. But we thought it'd be fun to just talk about guitar tone and in our style, just freeform stuff. So to start it off, like, one of my things about guitar tone is, especially with, players that I admire, is most of the time anyway, I think their initial guitar tone is my favorite guitar tone that they have. And I don't know why that is, but oftentimes, they use kind of this weird makeshift setup, but it just sounds cool and unique. And I get attached to that. And then they, as musicians and artists, they go on this journey of finding tone or whatever is in their head. And in my opinion, a lot of times it's kind of fruitless because the tone they had initially is what I really dig, What do you think about that philosophy?
I kind of see what you're saying. And I was wondering, as you were saying that, if it might partly be because you get so used to their initial tone, and that's where you come to love the band at. And when they get out of that, it might be you pine for the old thing. It's just like everything about this, the old pedals are better, the old blah blah is better. There might be part of that, but some of it is, in an artist's career early on, they're super inspired too. So their playing is like, let's take the, Van Halen or something, those first Van Halen records. I mean, that's, the Brown sound and how great the tone is on that record. But his playing was so inspired almost. It was like, revolutionary, and he was super inspired. So maybe that has something to do with it. I don't know, because I know you've mentioned before when you were talking about people's tones changing in your mind being in a negative way, you've mentioned Van Halen. Like once he went through the whole PV, saga, the Ernie Ball and PV, it's like his tone kind of wasn't as, warm and fat or whatnot. And part of it might be inspirational playing right off the bat.
I think there might be something to that for sure. But I do think just listening to those first two albums, listening to the guitar sound and comparing it to like the stuff when he was doing when he started to work with PV or whoever on his own amps and his own guitars, to me, his sound just became more generic. It just became more like every other heavy metal guitar player's sound, in many ways. And the cool thing to me about his initial sound is it is just this weird confluence of that old Marshall Plexi he used and that weird Variac he used, and then that Phase 90, that was kind of the foundation of his sound. And to me, it's just this breathing, crazy, cool, alive sound that I think he got away from in his later guitar sounds. But you're right. I mean, part of that might be just my fondness for those albums and also, like you say, exactly. I mean, they were just young shits, piss and vinegar, and it was new, and he was inspired, and it's like, wow. I think that's part of it. But I don't know, man. I really think I'm going to have to do more A/B tests, but I think just listening to those sounds, I still think the best guitar sound he got was that initial guitar sound. It's just so freaking cool. And then also that guitar, right? That guitar was it was made up of seconds of Warmoth or Charvel or whatever it was, and then that funky pickup that he just slapped in there and screwed to the wood. I just think all those things just, you know, created this cool, funky new sound, you know, that for guitar. And then tuning down a half step, all that stuff, whatever. But yeah, I have such a fondness for that guitar sound. I just think it's so cool.
Those songs too. I mean, that's a big part of it. For me personally, looking at the career of Van Halen, I love the first 2 records. Beyond that, not so much. And especially later, you know, in the later years when by the time he was into PV, not even really that familiar with any of that stuff. So yeah, I mean, for me, tone is so much integrated into the song. You know, I get an example, just probably maybe within the last 2 weeks, I was watching some YouTube clip. I don't know what it was, but it had, as a backing track, it had a late era AC/DC song. So it must have been probably maybe from the early 2000s or something like that. I don't know the name of the song. And the guitar tone was like that perfect modern breakup guitar tone. And it just dawned on me as like, this sounds nothing like that organic killer sound from those first AC/DC records. There was just something to that sound that's kind of, it's not perfect. It's kind of off. It's organic. And just the way like Angus Young's vibrato is on those old records is completely different than it is now in the context of modern recording practices and getting like the perfect drum sound, the perfect guitar sound. It just kind of loses something. And again, I found myself wondering, is that because of the sound of the recording methods, or is it because of the songs? Because by this point, the AC/DC songs are kind of generic. Here's an AC/DC song, you know, like slide in the framework. When back in those early records, they were still kind of really into it and really inspired. There it is again. Angus Young doesn't sound like I remember him sounding. I mean, he's got a killer vibrato. It was there, but it was kind of just glossy, and it didn't have any of that like kind of like warmness to it that I really was drawn to his playing from.
No, that's an interesting way to look at it too, is also just maybe an artist that has been around that long too. Like you're saying, when you're young, you're inspired and you're playing differently. Maybe he's kind of trying too hard to sound like himself. You know what I mean? Like, I know, you know, and that might be another weird thing that artists come up against too. It's like, I've been doing this for 30, 40 years. You know, I have a sound, I have a way of playing, and maybe part of it is just them being trapped into their own mental thing of saying, I need to sound like Angus Young or something. But I also do think, though, there's a separate sonic evaluation that can go on aside from the songs and aside from that stuff, that just listening to the early tone of somebody and the current tone, you know, just on a sonic level. And like, again, like you were saying, I agree totally with like this striving for perfection in sounds. I think to me, it leaves me cold, because the thing that I love about older recordings or even newer recordings that don't focus so much on perfection is the overtones, or just maybe some phasing that goes on with slightly out of tune stuff, or just that stuff, which I think adds more character to recordings, or just drum sounds, drum levels in the mix, right? It's like, I hated it once the drums became a focus of a song, right? From a level perspective, it's like, well, you know, that's weird. Like if you listen to old recordings, the drums are set in that mix just right. They're driving it, but they're not the focus of the sound. Right. So anyway, I think there's a separate sonic evaluation that can go on aside from. I think these are interesting points because it's making me think about. You're right. I mean, there's these other factors that we can talk about that might affect the tone of somebody's playing or sound, you know? Yeah,
once they started taking like 2 weeks to get drum sounds, it kind of changed forever. I mean, the kind of guitar tone that still to this day turns my head, if I'm like doing something and something comes on and I start becoming aware of a guitar sound, it's always something old. And I'll own to the fact that a lot of that has to do with that nostalgia factor, but a lot of it is just the way those records sound. I mean, old blues records, they just sound amazing. And you're right. The drums sound like they're just in a room and they're putting down the backbeat and the groove of the song. And it's like all they need. And the guitar sounds in particular, there's not the perfect distortion. One of the things that just drives me nuts is overdrive pedals when you can hear the pedal giving the drive. There's no way to escape that if you're playing around the house, or you just want to get some sustain from your rig when you got to do it quietly. But on a record or live or something, when I hear like drive from an overdrive pedal, it just drives me nuts, because my focus is this organic guitar tone that there's no difference between clean and dirty. It's just what it is. And it's, that you can hear the amp working, you can feel the amp working. And that's my basis for all guitar tone that like kind of moves me. And outside of that, if there's something that's really weird sounding, which there was a lot in the 60s and 70s, that is really super cool too. Listen to the first Led Zeppelin record. That guitar tone is great, but it's so weird. Nobody would make a record like that today. They'd be going, that guitar is too shrill. It's too blah blah. It's not, it's not breaking up properly. It's kind of farty, and it's pretty incredible. I'd love to see us going back to that, where it's just like, we don't want the perfect overdrive. We don't want the perfect drum sound. We want the sound of drums in a room, so you kind of get that excitement, like you're there, and just give us a backbeat and lay some, organic guitar over top of it. That moves me, that type of stuff.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I love what you said about the sound of those pedals doing the distortion. It reminds me of, I forget what session it was, but Clapton was playing, and he was at a volume where he was working the amp to get his tone, and the engineer or somebody's like, no, it's way too loud. You can't do that. And he's like, yeah, this is my sound. It's like, so figure out a way to record it. And they did, right? And it's like they figured out a way, and it sounds amazing. I thought about this a lot too. There is nostalgia, but just because things evolve, it doesn't mean it's better, or just because things evolve doesn't mean it's an improvement. What's kind of cool too is we've seen these patterns in music, in genres and stuff too, right? Like some of these younger artists that are buying these, or look, like we talked about before, like punk or something else, where people were picking up these old instruments that were considered student models and then made them popular, right? And they were attracted to these things, A, because they were cheap, but B, they liked them because they were quirky sounding, right? Like an old Mustang or whatever, or an old Unibox, or some of these old or old amps. Or it kind of gives me some encouragement that some people along the way kind of get it, and then just recording methods, right? Some people have gone back to just like, okay, we're all in a room, we're all playing live, let's record it, let's lay it down, and then mix it. And so for guitar sounds and guitar tones, I'm the same way. I just feel like if you can get these organic sounds, it just moves me the same way it moves you. And yeah, the striving for perfection and eliminating overtones or any of this other stuff, the recordings leave me cold. I'm not moved by them at all,
Right. I have a friend who, speaking of tone, I think he coined this term. He calls it tone sleuthing, which means, that constant search for the perfect tone. And I think it's a great term, but when I think about that, I think about the way that a guitar player approaches tone. Usually for everybody, it doesn't matter if you get it from gear or if you get it from your actual playing. It's like a lifelong quest. And for me, that has always been, I'm really into gear, but what I'm looking for out of the gear is for the gear to pull the tone out of me, and not for me to necessarily find something that I plug into and I have that tone. I was kind of phrased this as a question, and it was going to be, what do you think of this? How does this relate to you? In the context of gear, and you've been collecting gear lately, do you see that as something that you're looking for a tone out of, or you're looking for it to get a tone out of you? Is kind of the winded way of what I'm trying to say here.
Yeah, I think the latter. I think that's a great way to look at it. I'm looking for different pieces of gear that, will elicit that from me. Yeah. And I think that's a great way to look at it. A lot of people are of the mind, and I'm kind of that way too, is where, tone is in the fingers and it's in the way you play. And I think that's exactly how I would look at it too. And the quest is cool. I mean, we all do it. You and I both have done it. I mean, I had gear that I wish I still had because I think about how it sounded, and I really long for that. So, but I went on my whole journey, man. I mean, I started out with a Marshall half stack, and then I went to all these other amps, like, you name it. I mean, I tried them all, or not all, but a lot of them. And I think you've gone through the similar journeys as well. And so, I mean, we're always looking for that. But I think your philosophy is so cool, and I agree with it. I think we're just looking for pieces of gear that will draw things out of us rather than it imposing a tone on us as players.
Right. I'm not one of those people that will audition a million tone caps in my guitar because I don't think they make any bit of difference as far as what I'm looking for. Or, pickups. I mean, if I have a guitar that I really like and it's not quite there, I might swap the pickups out. But usually I like the guitar as it is. And the reason it ended up in my possession was because it's a cool guitar. And I think I can make it work for what I do. So I'm not like on a constant hunt for the perfect pickups, the perfect tone caps, the perfect overdrive, the perfect this or that. It's more like, when I look for things, I look for something like, that's cool. That I get this new thing and suddenly I go a different direction in things that I'm able to get. And being like a home recordist is really cool because that makes me kind of like by default a tone sleuth because, it's one thing to get a really good tone that you're happy with and playing live. And for me, it's pretty easy now because I've been doing it for so long. But every single song that you record is a little bit different. And sometimes you need to get something that just fits the song better. And that's where tone sleuthing comes into it for me. And sometimes the way that you go about that in a recording context is completely different than what you would think. I mean, you're listening to what you're playing in the room, and it sounds like complete shit. But you hear it in the track, and it's perfect. It's perfect for the song.
You hit on another good perspective. There's live sound and there's recorded sound. And I think, as you were talking about Page's sounds on the Zeppelin records, that's exactly right. I mean, he was trying to find these sounds that fit these songs. They weren't your perfect guitar sound or whatever the perfect guitar sound is nowadays, but they fit the songs. And like you said, nowadays, some engineer would go, "Oh my God, that guitar sounds like shit." That's not the case. It sounds great in the context of that particular song. And so I think that's a great observation. And again, that's what I dig in terms of tone for any instrument or placement in a mix or any of that other stuff. And so again, like I just really, I don't like this striving for perfection in tones or sounds because I think it just sterilizes everything. And then because those other things to me add these weird, indefinable emotional elements to a song or a composition. And if you take them away, then you just have this weird sterile, I don't know, it's weird. It's hard to describe, but I think you get it. And I think other people get it too. And so those are the people I'm drawn to, are the people who get that, who have that philosophy, who get it and try and strive for these sounds, like you were saying, that might not necessarily sound great on their own or isolated, but man, in that mix, they sound so great. I mean, it elevates the song, and it just fits that particular context. So.
And they become defining tones too. And another generation of people doing recordings will like bring these records in and say, I like this sound right here. How do we get this sound right here?
I love this discussion, man, because I think it's a multifaceted thing that a lot of us don't think about all the time, about tone. And again, I think of some of my favorite tones, like Leslie West playing through that Junior and that weird PA system that he bought. It wasn't a guitar amp. It was a PA system that he was playing through. And it just sounds amazing. Or one of my favorite guitar tones is Andy Summers' early stuff with the Police, where he's playing through a Marshall half stack and that weird telly with all the weird electronics inside of it. But he got a great sound. And I was telling you, I saw them later several years ago and their reunion tour, and he was playing all these this whole Mesa Boogie rig. And his sound was totally different. It didn't sound like Andy Summers to me. It didn't sound like him playing through that Marshall half stack with that old telly. It sounded weird.
Which is interesting because it brings us back to what we're talking about. It's like, is it in the hands or is it in the gear? I don't think it's that black and white. I mean,
yeah, exactly.
It's an interesting topic for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think you're right. I mean, I do think a lot of it is in the hands. I think with gear you can sound different and not better or improved in some ways. And for me, But again, I mean, maybe some of this is psychological. It's like I remember these sounds, like or like James Honeyman Scott got a cool sound, and he was playing through a bunch of weird stuff back then. But I don't know. I just think it's fascinating to think about and talk about, and I think we've come up with some interesting takes on it, just other than just talking about gear. I mean, there's the psychological aspect, and then there's how we think about us interacting with our gear.
Right.
Yeah. What other guitar tones that from the past or present can you think of that you really dig that kind of fit into what we're talking about?
God, there's so many, and I have like a whole room full of records here I'm looking at, but I'm probably not going to come up with one. I mean, again, I like any of the old blues records, like a lot of the old soul records have really great guitar tones. And when you talk about rock, there's so much stuff from the 60s through the 80s that just, I mean, the 80s had I'm not just talking about what was on the radio in the 80s, but there's some great sounding records back then. If I could think of an example right now, I have an Only Ones record from then, this band called the Only Ones. And that has some really cool 80s guitar rock sounds on it, pop rock sounds. But again, I always wonder, is this just because, the nostalgia factor? But since things were recorded completely differently back then, to now, and the approach to making a record back then was completely different than it is now for the most part, then I think there's something in there that, it's like we've evolved, and maybe I just don't like where we've evolved to. Yeah. So, I don't know. Get off my lawn.
I think that's where my head's at too. I mean, I think about it. I think most people think of evolution as improving, but that's not necessarily the case. And I'm kind of that mind too, in terms of recording and gear sounds and stuff like that. I have heard some newer sounds that I dig. There's a band called Krungbin I don't know how to pronounce it, but they're like this trio, and they do this kind of quasi surf music. And the guy plays just through a reissued Strat with some aftermarket pickups, and then like a Fender Silverface reissue something. But he gets a great guitar sound. It's super cool. It's very, I mean, granted, they're playing kind of something that is hearkening back to, surf music, but it sounds great. He gets a great tone. He gets a great sound, and I dig it a lot. And the band itself just sounds really cool. And so I think there are other current players that I'm digging, because of their sound and because of the tones they're getting. So that's encouraging, I think.
It's worth pointing out, too, that, we're just talking in general terms, because I actually know people who are engineers and producers now that actually approach making a record the way that they did back in the 60s and 70s. I mean, it's just that they strive for that, and their stuff sounds really cool. You can still do it. I mean, even with the technology we have right now, you can still get a lot of elements of that music that, what they got back then, just by approaching the process from an old school way, which is cool. I'm really thankful for that there's still a lot of people into that.
Yeah, me too. And that's a good point. And, it's not like the whole, it's not like wholesale, everything's gone that way. And that's another thing I dig too, are the people that are still kind of, even with the modern technology and digital and all this other stuff, still trying to get these organic sounds that so many of us really appreciate. I think this is cool. It took directions that I didn't think we were going to go in, but I think it's totally cool because I think everything we talked about was valid with regard to tone. And I mean, you and I, we love mid-rangey guitar sounds that are, not the smiley face with a bunch of bass and treble. There are all kinds of guitar sounds that I love that aren't necessarily that way either, but I think it's cool. I think it's cool to think about tone from these perspectives, man.
I agree.
Well, cool. Well, it's good to be back, man. It's good to talk to you, man. I've missed our conversations, and we're going to try to get back on track with this stuff because we really enjoy it. And but it's just been weird times. But yeah, we're gonna keep plugging away, man. You got anything else to say?
No, not really. I mean, I could talk about this shit for a lot longer. There's no point at this point.
Well, let's wrap this one up, man, and we'll do another one. Thanks for listening, as always. Check us out on social media. And we're going to keep plugging away on these things. And Chris, why don't you sign us off?
Thanks for listening. Be safe. Be well.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks, man.